Next, Broadway embraces new traditions and reinvents itself in the 60s and 70s. From West Side Story to Hair, from cabaret to a chorus line, it's all on Broadway, the American musical. Hello, I'm Julie Andrews. In the 1960s, the traditional Broadway musical fell out of step as rock music, the civil rights movement, and the Vietnam War had a profound effect on American culture. But beginning with West Side Story, a new generation of creative talent reimagined what the musical could do. Songwriters like Stephen Sondheim, Bach and Harnick, Kander and Ebb, along with directors such as Hal Prince, Bob Fosse, Michael Bennett, created astonishing new works, new sounds, and a bold new tradition for Broadway.
What I like best about West Side Story is it's an amalgam of book, music, lyrics, and dance. In that sense, it's a remarkable piece, I think. You're going to see a kind of choreographed movement that's neither ballet nor traditional musical comedy dance, but you're going to see action in movement. That was what was new about West Side Story.
I think Jerry Robbins' choreography is an authorship in that show. I don't think all choreography always is, but certainly in that show. The marriage of dance movement and storytelling was new to the theater.
Jerome Robbins was the prime example of the idea that someone could direct and choreograph a Broadway musical, that they weren't two separate jobs to be given to two different people, but that the whole thing could move as one. Other people had done it before him, for instance, Agnes DeMille, and he took things like the idea of the Dream Ballet, Oklahoma, and applied it to the whole piece.
In the 1950s, while the choreographer Jerome Robbins was making his mark on Broadway with such shows as The King and I and Peter Pan, he was also developing a pet project, adapting Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet into a musical.
Tonight, tonight, it all began tonight. I saw you and the world went away. Tonight, tonight, there's only you tonight. What you...
I read it and I said, what the hell would I do to try to make this alive? And I thought, well, what if I made it today? How would I feel about it? And that was it. That's all I needed, and bang, I was into it.
I know now I was wrong.
Robbins collaborated with playwright Arthur Lawrence and composer Leonard Bernstein, and they set the tragedy amid the warring gangs of New York City.
There was one area where we did break new ground, and that is in the subject matter. That was the beginning of it being okay to die, to be raped, to be murdered in a musical. At the same time, Lenny Bernstein's music was different from anybody who has ever written for musical theater. I think it's the most exciting thing about West Side Story. It has a vitality, an energy, an originality, and it says America to me.
Life can be bright.
alright in America.
If you can fight in America.
Life is alright in America.
If you're all white in America.
The show is driven by the music. It's intense from beginning to end. It is a mixture of Wagner, Stravinsky, Mahler, Mambo, Broadway. It's all rolled into one. It packs a punch.
In bringing his great talent as a symphonic composer, Leonard Bernstein made a kind of score that had rhythms that people just hadn't had on Broadway. And then you have the genius of Robbins' choreography and direction. The influences, inspirations are still so potent today in its clothing and its look and its stylization. I think that West Side Story was the forerunner of all MTV with its style, putting people stylized dancing in the middle of streets, as in the movie.
When West Side Story opened in 1957, its reviews were mixed. Broadway's smash hit that season was actually The Music Man, featuring a very different kind of dance in the gymnasium.
76 trombones hit the counterpoint, 110 cornets blaze the way.
People walk out on shows, and those are very often the shows that become historical. And if you told them, you know, you walked out on West Side Story in 1957, I did not. Yes, you did, and you walked out with 98 other people every night that the show ran on Broadway. No kidding, right. And a few years later, it was, West Side Story.
West Side Story not only brought decidedly untraditional subject matter to the musical stage, it ushered in a new breed of director-choreographer who insisted on performers who could dance, sing, and act. The show also united two ambitious and talented young friends. A 29-year-old producer, Harold Prince, who wanted to direct, and a 27-year-old lyricist, Stephen Sondheim, who wanted to compose.
I just wanted to meet Leonard Bernstein. I called Oscar Hammerstein, and I said, I don't want to do just lyrics for anything. I want to write music. And he said, I think it would be a very good idea for you. He said, it'll frustrate you about writing music, but these are professionals and distinguished ones, Robbins and Bernstein and Lawrence, and I think you would learn a lot. So I did, and I did learn a lot.
We were good friends. And it's true, we sat in Walgreens drugstore and ate bacon, lettuce, tomato sandwiches and talked about the theater and what we'd like to do in it.
It would be 13 years before Hal Prince would direct a Stephen Sondheim show. But together, they would reimagine what a musical could sing about on Broadway. The late 1950s and early 1960s produced some of Broadway's most memorable musicals. Gypsy, starring Ethel Merman as an overbearing showbiz mother.
Well, you'll be great. Gonna have the whole world on a plate.
Bye Bye Birdie, a parody of Elvis Presley and the dangers of rock and roll. Camelot, the King Arthur story that became indelibly linked to the Kennedy presidency. And How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, a satirical send-up of America's corporate culture. 1964 was a watershed year, with Barbra Streisand immortalizing the role of Fanny Brice in Funny Girl.
Lovers are very special people. They're the luckiest people in the
That same season, Carol Channing starred in the nostalgic Hello, Dolly.
Look at that crowd up ahead. Pardon me if my old spirit shows.
Channing was followed by a parade of musical theatre legends in the title role. Pearl Bailey, Ethel Merman, and Mary Martin, who brought the show to Vietnam to entertain American troops. But the biggest hit of 1964, which broke the record for the longest-running show in Broadway history, was perhaps the most unlikely. Fiddler on the Roof.
If I were a rich man, all day long I'd biddy bum. If I were a wealthy man, I wouldn't have to work hard. If I were a bitty rich, diddle.
Based on Sholem Aleichem's short stories depicting a Jewish village in 1905 Russia, Fiddler was the last original work Jerome Robbins created for Broadway.
The key to making Fiddler work was Jerome Robbins' idea. I can't tell you how many meetings we had where he said, "What is this story about?" And one of us said, "It's about the changing of a way of life, of a set of traditions." Robbins got very excited and he said, "Well, if it's about tradition, then we have to have an opening number which tells the audience what some of these traditions are."
Tradition, 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 tradition.
Tradition. It's this. It's that. It's everyone standing in a row, holding hands. This is the way we live. This is what we believe in. And those traditions are going to be broken. Fiddler is about that.
I remember the day that I registered at college, Fiddler on the Roof opened on Broadway. We didn't realize it at the time. It was the sunset of the old-style Broadway musical that came in with Rodgers and Hammerstein. The opening number, Tradition, was actually about the closing of an era of the Broadway musical. The curtain rose on Fiddler, but it came down on that kind of show.
It was really the advent of rock and roll that pushed Broadway musical out of the mainstream of American culture, because up until then, Broadway music had been the top 40, the top 10 hit parade music of the country, and that started to change. And by the late 1960s, it was a done deal.
Hello, Dolly. This is Nurse Dolly.
In May 1964, Louis Armstrong's rendition of Hello, Dolly spent a week at the top of the charts, breaking the Beatles' run of 3 straight months.
You keep blowing, still growing, you still going strong.
It was one of the last times in the 20th century that Broadway had a #1 hit song.
Well, the culture is definitely shifting, but Broadway was basically trying to ignore the 60s. The typical musical at the height of the Vietnam War could be something like How Now, Dow Jones, or George M. Shows that are promises that have absolutely nothing to do with the main culture of the moment. It was really the consummation of Broadway musical falling out of sync with pop culture.
By 1966, protests and demonstrations were becoming an unavoidable presence across America. Hal Prince, now directing shows, was inspired by the civil rights struggle as he prepared a new work with music and lyrics by John Kander and Fred Ebb.
It was very stormy in our country when I started work on Cabaret. And I brought in a photograph from Life magazine, a 2-page spread of a bunch of Aryan Nazi boys snarling at the camera. And of course, it was in our country, and it was them snarling at some poor little black girl. So I used that to support the contention that wherever human beings are, terrible things potentially can happen.
Cabaret was an adaptation of the Berlin stories of Christopher Isherwood and a play based on them. The show depicted the debauchery of Berlin between the wars and the Nazi rise to power, presented by a master of ceremonies at the Kit Kat Club.
I was in the army in 1949 in Germany. I went to a little nightclub called Maxime's, which was in the cellar of a bombed-out church. And there, a very diminutive MC came out with lipstick on his mouth and eyelashes and rouge to hide how really old he was.
Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome. Fremde, étranger, stranger. Glücklich zu sehen, je suis enchanté. Happy to see you, bleibe reste stay.
Joel Grey, made up in a way that even if you knew what he looked like, he'd be unrecognizable, comes out and starts singing a song that we all know now as Willkommen. But my friend Sarah Fishko and I looked at each other and said, is this show in German? We didn't know what it was. It was very out there, and it had all this sort of androgynous sexuality. It was mind-blowing. And the audience was baffled. It had a stronger effect on me than Fiddler 2 years earlier had, or Hello, Dolly. You felt you were seeing something completely different.
Cabaret, I would say, pushed the envelope of what people were seeing in the Broadway musical. Most people thought it was a terrible idea, a musical about Nazi Germany, but Hal and John and Fred and Joe Masteroff had this very dark vision, and they found a framework in terms of the cabaret songs in which the musical numbers commented on the action.
Boris Aronson did the original set. Nobody's ever been greater designer than Boris Aronson. There were 2 musicals on stage. One took place in real rooms and one took place in limbo. And in limbo were these numbers which indirectly commented on the real book upstage. Somewhere in the middle of the second act, Sally Bowles leaves the real world, walks through a mylar curtain into the unreal limbo world and sings Cabaret.
What good is sitting alone in your room? Come hear the music play. Life is a cabaret, old chum.
At the end of that song, she goes and gets an abortion. What she's found out at the beginning of the song is that she's pregnant. What she decides at the end of the song is that she doesn't want to have the baby.
Right this way, our table's waiting. Start by admitting.
That's a pretty powerful material for a Broadway musical comedy.
I think that the thing that you have to take on board is the profound disruption of Vietnam.
This is the dawning of the age.
And the awareness of the American public that they were in this terrible war that they couldn't get out of, that they really was not winnable, and it was on some level probably unjust. In song and theater, there was a great deal of protest against the war. And it divided the culture.
By 1967, the war in Vietnam and the protests against it were polarizing the country. Two young actors, Jerome Ragney and James Rado, seized upon that friction as the storyline for a new musical production. For backing, they sought out Joseph Papp, a maverick producer who had just created the Public Theater, a non-commercial venue downtown. Known for presenting Shakespeare in Central Park, Papp was also a champion of contemporary theater.
Vietnam was a major plot point in the show, but the war wasn't really the main thing. The main thing was the lifestyle. It seemed to be more about hippies, you know, growing their hair long and living in wearing different kind of clothes.
Gimme a head with hair, long, beautiful hair, shining, gleaming, steaming, flaxen, waxen.
The show was called Hair. It was the first Broadway musical with an entire score of rock music.
I'd never seen a Broadway musical when I wrote Hair. I like funky music. So that was sort of, and when they said, well, we want a rock and roll score, I said, well, to me, that's